everybody has been here all day. I'm Alice Sharp. I'm the Artistic Director of Invisible Dust, and I've been the moderator all day. But just in case there's some new arrivals for this last section, we've got TJ Demos, and then we've got Alon and Daniel from Cooking Sections. TJ is going to start off with his presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation with everybody here, and hopefully everyone's held on to those questions that they had earlier. So I'm just going to introduce TJ. TJ is an award-winning writer on the intersection of contemporary art, global politics, and ecology. I think probably many of you have read things he's published worldwide on the ability of artistic practice to invent innovative strategies that challenge dominant social, political, and economic conventions. And his work has appeared in many, many magazines, including Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today. He's also the professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he's founder and director of its Center for Creative Ecologies, where from 2018 to 20, he worked on a research project beyond the end of the world. So he takes on a lot of amazing things, and I think also probably people know he also is on the editorial board of Art Journal, he was between 2004 and 8, and currently sits on the editorial board of Third Text and on the advisory board of Grey Room. So welcome, TJ. Really looking forward to your presentation and having you as part of our event this afternoon.
Thank you, Alice. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope so. Please interrupt if something is not working right. It should be about maybe a little shorter than expected, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then I look forward to the conversation afterwards. Thank you so much to Yaka for the invitation. It's great to be with you. I wish it could be in person. Thanks in advance to Alice for moderating and my co-panelists for discussion. So this short presentation is an attempt to begin to answer the question, what can art do within the context of a climate emergency? And I think it can do many things. Well, this is a text that attempts to begin to sketch out some of the possibilities. It's called The Work of Art in the Age of Climate Emergency. Art is infinity, ellipsis, multiplicity, endlessness, potentiality, possibility, but not just. It's also infinity minus infinity, given inescapable historical contingency. Its cultural expression subject to the differentiated determinations of economy, politics, racial and colonial capital. Graphs of carbon concentration disfigure art's poetics in the centuries-long sweep of the racial capitalocene. Art is imaginative liberation. It opens a portal to conceptual speculation, strums with emotional intensities, materializes a radical difference within the intolerability of oppression, the patterning of everyday life, its banalities and constraints. Art's momentum decolonizes the mind, emancipates the future, at least to some degree, even in the greatest state of unfreedom, making intolerable life livable. Art is collective emancipation, a mode of thinking and acting together, of living otherwise, beyond the impositions of competitive individualism. It helps us value what hasn't yet been destroyed, raising up the undervalued, the disenfranchised, centering the dispossessed. Art can also be the practice of mutual aid, of feminist caretaking, of multi-species love, beginning with our multi-species selves. Aesthetics gives form to collective belonging, materializing solidarity, even if not objectifying it, providing under the right circumstances, insurgent political belonging within lives otherwise alienated, within surveillance capitalism, anti-social media, algorithmic governance, neo-colonial extractivism. Let's consent to not being singular. Art can be a mode of real survival under deadly circumstances, and a source of singular joy within life-threatening climate emergency. Altering institutions, it can reconfigure reality. As process, event, relationality, it can open a world to come within the lived experience and cruel expectations of futurelessness against all odds. Art becomes a place to live, a houseless home, a space in which to breathe. And when we breathe together. Art is critical interrogation, the piercing analysis of ideological conditions, including situating one's own social, racial, and economic privileges and vulnerabilities and privations. Through its lens, grotesque inequality, violent oppression, intolerable images come into view. It also offers the imagination, critical infrastructure to transcend them. As conceptual phase shift, art can bring real material transformation, not simply escapist imagination, even if escapism and false solutions also remain a possibility, even a likelihood within the neoliberal cultural industry. Art is a training ground for the future. Under the right circumstances, art provides the infrastructure for transcending social divisions, including those of liberal identity politics and its divide and conquer tactics. With its constructive situations, we can move beyond the limits of ethno-nationalist identification, of white supremacy, of heteropatriarchy, all of which obscure class antagonisms and destroy coalitions. That's because the most liberated art represents and encourages and enables a solidarity of equality that is multiracial and working class in the expanded sense of grouping those who work for a living, who provide the labor that makes the world run, including informal and domestic and unpaid, precarious labor, exploited, insecure, unemployed, houseless, and undocumented. Radical art positions itself against racial and colonial capitalism, including those who own the means of production of a world that is set on destroying itself, socially, politically, economically, environmentally. Climate justice is racial justice, is migrant justice, is labor justice, is queer justice, is economic justice, is multi-species justice. The horizon of emancipation is collective liberation. Art documents violence, but also provides juridico-political interventions, real materialist transformation, institutional change, institutive becomings, cosmopolitical speculation, and realizations. It works to hold perpetrators responsible for climate crimes, for crimes against the earth and its diverse beings, for ecocide and genocide, even while the legal forums that exist remain inadequate, were always designed by and for the powerful. But art also invents new forums to imagine and realize justice beyond and even in despite of the law, where law fails justice, oppresses, and justifies violence. Art offers an onto-epistemological intervention. It's a mode of worlding, or de-worlding, or re-worlding. Aesthetic interventions can dramatically shift cultures and participate in and catalyze the invention of new ones. Art is creative world building practiced on an everyday basis as an inextinguishable human and therefore multi-species capacity, an irrevocable attribute of life itself, even while life remains so thoroughly damaged and multiply colonized. There's no future of ecological sustainability, of multi-species flourishing, of socioeconomic justice and political solidarity, of equality and equity, of diversity and inclusion, without the creative and artistic imagination that will first dream of those things, represent them, offer stories that compellingly describes them, offer images that make those futures compelling, that allow us to feel and desire and build them. And no such future will ever exist if we don't commit the collective labor of realizing them, according to a truth that must be grounded in histories of the oppressed, according to which the most excluded must be seated at the table and included in the discussion, not as a token or exemplary representative, but on the basis of equality that comes as the result of struggle. We need new algorithms of life and land, new futures from suppressed pasts, survival beyond imperial modernity. Remember the future. As we face the end of the world, the end of racial and colonial capital, the end of its militarized and policed regimes, it's up to all of us to join the forces of global struggle, of structural transformation, laboring toward eco-socialism and multi-species justice, where art is a practice, a rehearsal, and an audition for the collective subject we must become, inventing the we of the post-Anthropocene, a we that rejects exterminism, genocide, and ecocide, and contests the false solutions of green capitalism, and that forms the historical and future subject of change. Art is infinity beyond infinity. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, TJ. So as you might imagine, we've got a screen here, so we can see TJ here, so we don't need to turn around if anyone's worrying about that. And thank you so much for that really moving, I think, presentation. And also, we had a chat a couple of days ago, and you had a very dark kind of view of the future, and it's really amazing to hear a lot of very positive things coming out in what you've just been expressing, which really filled my heart, actually, I have to say, because we were discussing, you know, how COP had made a lot of people feel really quite down about the future of the Earth and the future of the environment. And actually, what I was discussing with TJ then was the role of art, and now very, very eloquently, he's brought us into that place of art being a place of transformation. And I guess it's the first question to you, I guess the three of you really, but to start off perhaps with you, TJ. You know, you've said in the publication, we're living in a time of profound transformation, and we must figure out how to live within a caring relationship with the world. And in Heidi Ballott's thing, she quoted Bruno Latour, and he says, we need to live as, understand how to live as earthlings, which is a really lovely expression, I think. And I just, what do you think in terms of what do you think of the role of art in bringing this kind of earth-caring transformation?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I agree with the proposal that we do indeed need to think about how to do that. There's tremendous resources out there. It's not like we have to reinvent this. There's long traditions of ways of practicing forms of caretaking and living in sustainable relations with the more than human world. It's really, I think, I would argue, it's really the oppressive domination of an economic regime, and it's corporate leadership that prevents us from doing that, including the military and policing that enforces the rule of a kind of advanced, extreme, militarized neoliberalism. So I don't think while I agree with the direction of that question in terms of what we need to do, we certainly need to return to that kind of form of life. And it's not simply a return, it's also an invention of new forms of life. So it's not necessarily a regressive step toward pre-modern traditions. It's also, we can learn from those also, but we also have to, I think, utilize all means at our disposal, including technology, in positive, non-harmful ways. But it's really the real challenge, like with the COP26 in Glasgow, is somehow how to deal with the political and economic inertia that keeps us locked within a growth-based fossil fuel economy. And that's not because art has failed to imagine alternatives. Certainly, there are tons of resources and all sorts of speculative proposals and actually existing practices that we can enlarge and amplify and practice. But until we get rid of those oppressive structures, rebuild institutions, take back politics from corrupted forms of governance, I think that we're not going to be able to make much progress. So that's part of the pessimism that I feel after, for instance, decades of these UN-sponsored climate summits, where we've seen the same thing repeatedly, the promise of non-binding contributions to decarbonization. Even while over the last 30 years, we've seen the steady growth of polluting emissions at the same time. It's hard to be optimistic at all, despite the kind of boosterism and celebration by political leaders that they've actually accomplished something at COP. So for me, art indeed can be and is a place to live life otherwise, outside of those conditions. But it can't just be a parallel small kind of utopian situation. We have to think critically of new strategies and diverse tactics to intervene in how the current world is run.
And for you, Alan and Daniel, because I would say that from looking at your art, it's also quite transformational. Is that something that you are interested in your work, that people are seeing things in new ways through experiencing your work?
Yeah, I think for us, on the one hand, is to understand all these very kind of sad stories as we were like narrating them before, and then what do we do, or what do institutions do, or what do museums, as what we were presenting before, what do they do, and also how to take steps both on the individual level, but also at the kind of much higher up the chain, if you want. And if we think that some of these systems are broken, and some of them are indeed, how do we take a step forward and think of, perhaps certain interventions that could proactively try to address or start addressing, or at least bringing the awareness to a level that those steps could be taken.
And I think in that space, of course, kind of as TJ, I think, was alluding in his presentation, art is, and the space of cultural production can indeed kind of give the space to kind of imagine a world otherwise, or to live a world otherwise. But at the same time, I think what for us is really interesting is like, how do you push it kind of beyond the world of kind of cultural production, and where kind of art can become a platform to seep into kind of other spaces. Because I think many times we also, because kind of art is kind of so, it's also a very comfortable place to kind of imagine the world otherwise. And then many times as cultural producers and cultural workers, we're confined, you know, like to, oh, in that world you can imagine otherwise, but like how do we kind of use kind of the power of that world in order to kind of take it to quote unquote the real world, right? And of course we know like very well that these boundaries between those spaces do not exist, and kind of ideas kind of are constantly seeping from like cultural production into industry, into technology. There's a constant kind of co-option of kind of cultural currency in order to kind of facilitate kind of capital growth, etc. So how do we kind of mobilize kind of our actions in that space in order to kind of disrupt kind of the systems, I think, that are confining us, like both in our lives and kind of in our lives of kind of cultural producers, I think is something that is really important today to kind of think about and kind of strive for.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one thing that I think when listening to TJ's analysis is that there's no one path to a sustainable future. You know, who's going to be involved in a sustainable future? Who's going to be making the decisions of whether we go for X type of power, Y type of power? You know, the whole debate that happened about coal at COP, where India blocked, you know, the word, you know, phase out and went to phase down. You know, so there's a whole number of different issues there about which countries are going to be making the decisions on a personal level or in a community level. Is it going to be the poor, deprived communities that are going to be making the decisions about the future, or is it going to be the same, you know, corporations and the governments that are making those decisions? So I don't know if you wanted to kind of draw a little bit more out of that, about that, you in particular, TJ, like who's involved in these decisions and who is left out?
Sure. Well, I think the relation between the contemporary art system and politics more broadly is a really crucial question, as has been just alluded to. And I think this is indeed the case. We have to challenge some of those borders, because they're enforced on the one hand, and we know that they don't exist in other ways on the other hand, and that art institutions, for instance, are completely involved within the global economy of fossil fuel production, of extractivism, of military arms manufacturing, and so on. So I think collective practices that are increasingly aligned and connected to social movements are really an important step forward. And for me, I've been trying to trace these and research them, and also be involved in them as a participant, as an activist. These are really crucial. For instance, the Debt Collective in the US context is an organization of people who have figured out ways to purchase debt that gets commodified for a fraction of what it's worth. And then they have been attempting to absolve that debt. So this is including people who have huge, enormous amounts of debt to because of medical bills, or because of entanglement within the prison industrial complex. So the Debt Collective is working toward, and they've realized this, they've actually affected many people's lives in a positive way by abolishing debt. It's actually a totally amazing project. Or if you look at Strike MoMA, the current ongoing activists' challenge to the conditions of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the fact that many of their board of trustees members sit on corporations responsible for the extraction of resources in Puerto Rico, or the production of weapons and arms, or they support police unions and the most conservative reactionary politicians like Trump. This is an incredible and important way to challenge the existence of political and economic hierarchies within the artistic system and its institutions. It's not enough to do this, but it's certainly a step forward to bring about transformation. And one last project, Jonas Stahl's, I showed one of his recent projects, but he's also organized something called Collectivize Facebook to try to challenge the privatized existence of social media platforms. How can we remove them from private structures and collectivize them? Because we know that social media has become so important to our lives in all sorts of ways. Maybe we should, he argues, this should be considered a public resource, not something that can be privatized and profited from in the way that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all other social media platforms generally are. So that also is a really interesting project. There are very concrete examples of how we can enact transformation, and people are working on this, and it has a lot to do with challenging hierarchies and inequality, both within the art world and the way the art world connects to the larger corporate ecosystem.
Absolutely, I think, and it gives me a bit of hope actually hearing about this collective. I haven't heard about that before, the collective idea on social media, which, as we all know, is having an absolutely horrific effect, particularly on young people. I don't know if other people have got teenagers, but I have, and I'm just so aware of the despair that the social media is causing at the moment. And you probably know about the whistleblower case of the Facebook employee in America. It's very, very brave, taking up some of those things. And actually this is all weaved into the whole way we look at the climate crisis too, because people feel overwhelmed because they're being fed more and more negative images rather than feeling that they can actually do something about it. Is there anything else you wanted to, on that kind of idea about who's involved and people, feeling included?
Yeah, I guess also perhaps connecting to what was mentioned before, that, in terms of outcomes from COP, that the countries that were or weren't pushing certain agendas, also that not to kind of also externalize, because like the fact that something happens in one country is also because perhaps here we want greener energy or or better production, and that has been just outsourced. All the toxicity and all the problematics of like working in dirty kind of industries has been all outsourced elsewhere. So also not to blame those elsewhere, because we are also creating the problem. To be, I think it's important also that we've been thinking a lot about it, how to reconnect those extremes of these voracious like supply chains in order not to, we cannot externalize it or just like ship it elsewhere.
Have you thought about doing Climavore, for example, in a developing country? Because that would be quite a different context to the way you've done it so far.
We tried not to see these differences, because it's very hard, also these definitions for me, like I wouldn't even know how to start taxonomizing these countries like that. But I think it's more precisely because all these supply chains are so entangled that I don't think we're all kind of connected along the chain, right? Yeah. So I think that's what we're trying to do, is that one little thing here affects like so many other places. So how to start internalizing waste.
Yeah, and in that sense, look at salmon, right? That's kind of, this is what we've been kind of, one of the lenses we've been looking through. And again, like you think of like Scotland, for instance, to be one of the most kind of forward-thinking, kind of environmentally kind of attuned like countries in the world today, yet it enables kind of a practice that is clearly kind of having a disastrous effect on the environment. And it is happening there because Norwegian-owned corporations cannot practice the way they do like in Norway. Therefore, they have been like for years now, finding kind of more lax, kind of like countries with more lax regulations to basically, create kind of a system where they can continue kind of to generate profit. And this is for me exactly where in these kind of moments of kind of developing versus like developed versus kind of like global north to global south, like completely are breaking down. And we need to kind of really think of like, where are we positioned on kind of these spaces of production, extraction, and kind of consumption, and how we can rewire, in a sense, the system, and how do we like try to kind of even out the plane, in a sense, or kind of put, like tie all of these like extremities that, again, I think by the fact that they are being kind of put in these kind of binaries is in order to enable kind of the fueling of the system more and more, right? It's enabling kind of to put more pressure on like the developing versus like, and seeing the developed as the ones that kind of are going to bring the solution, where the problems originate many times like from those spaces.
Completely. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Hopefully, Judith and Anna, are you ready with your microphones? Yeah. Okay. So if you'd like to raise your hand, and it can be just a very short question or a statement, whatever people are interested in contributing. And if you speak Spanish and you want to ask a question in Spanish, that's absolutely fine. What we will do is we'll put our headphones on so we can understand your question and make sure we can answer it. And I will ask it in English to you, TJ, so you've got that there. So yes, who would like to ask a question from the audience at this point? Or can you say who you are?
Yes, hi, my name is Heidi Ballet. I'm a curator, and I was involved with the YACA publication, obviously. So thank you very much. Thank you, TJ, for your very nice presentation also. I want to go back a bit to this developing world and developed world binary, because I think in the morning we left it out a bit, but I think it's a very important point, actually, also in what we expect from the COP maybe, or what we think these countries should be doing, but we never talk about climate justice, actually. The fact that also the sentiment you feel in countries like China that keep saying that we have, in the developed world, caused the problem and we should take a bigger responsibility. It's a very complicated topic. So I just want to say thank you also for bringing that in, and also bring in this, something I didn't talk about this morning, this theory that Christian Parenti has, that there will be a politics of the armed lifeboat in the future, or he's fearing that that we will be in the rich West, we will be on a lifeboat, but they will be pushing off all those people from the developing world who will not be saved, and somehow they will be left in a chaos. And I don't know if I have a question further, but I just wanted to bring this in, and yeah, that's it.
No, it's extremely valuable. Thank you so much, Heidi. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question before we go back to the speakers? Can't see anyone got a hand? Okay, well, let's go back to this very interesting discussion about the responsibility and the interconnection of developed, I mean, whatever term you do, it doesn't do it justice, let's face it. Global North, Global South, people don't like, but for the moment, I'll call it developing countries and our interrelationships, which are so complex. And for example, TJ, in your essay for the publication, you talked about Ottobong Makanga's work and her relationship with both mining, the sort of colonialism of her own African landscapes, and also, I think, actually quite a lot of mysticism in her work as well. So it's a really interesting kind of combination. And you said to me that you'd worked with her quite a lot. So I'd just be interested to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, in Ottobong's work, she deals with extractivism quite often in relationship to sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular, looking at the kind of mining conditions in her research that forms the basis of her more aestheticized and speculative types of installation and painting practice, which is really interesting to consider and learn more about. And I think it helps us actually break down some of the potential binaries between global North and South, because we know that we're living in an entangled world, and a lot of the extractivism that happens in the global South is owned by the global North. There's all sorts of relations of exporting forms of pollution to the global South through northern extractive industries, and also financial recuperation of resources in the North from the South. And these are, really it's nearly impossible to actually separate the two, even though there is, I think, a historical relation for still retaining some of the language of global North and South. But I think, you know, part of the problem is with the COP attempting to agree on some, for instance, number of agreed upon global warming in the near future, trying to keep, for instance, 1.5 degrees Celsius, the limit of global warming, even though we know that COP is completely failing to do that. But even using an abstract statistic like that, or an abstract number, is problematic, because we know that global warming, global heating is unevenly distributed, and some areas of the world will be much more affected than others. I'm reminded of one person, Asad Rehman, who said recently, he's part of COP26 Coalition, which is more of an activist organization. And he was directing his comments at the results of COP26, which was largely led by elite developed countries in the global North. And he says, you're setting with the 1.5 agreement or aspiration, he says, you're setting the planet on fire and claiming to act. Your greenwashing kills, and no amount of spinning will mask that. But we are not without hope. It will not rest with you, but with us. And we don't compromise on justice. So I think it's, you know, it's important to see the present context of climate breakdown within that kind of antagonism, which we know is long-standing, hundreds of years old, and it comes out of the legacy of colonial rule, white supremacy, slavery. So how can we understand those conditions in the present? I think the idea of the armed lifeboat as a future dystopia is already with us. We're already living that right now. And we can see these conditions in the Mediterranean or on the US-Mexico border, in India as well, and in all sorts of countries from Brazil to the Philippines. So what does that mean when we're trying to think these emergencies together instead of isolating potential extreme responses to climate breakdown into the near future? I think the challenge for all of us is how to connect the emergencies of climate breakdown to the emergencies of the ongoingness of colonialism, of extractivism, and forms of structural racism. This is, you know, to connect environmental emergencies to social justice and economic emergencies is the really big challenge. And that will ultimately refuse the simple binary of global North and South.
Absolutely. I think within that, the other aspect that you mentioned a lot and connects to Cooking Section's work is the role of nature. And you were mentioning multi-species when you were looking at all your areas of equalities in your presentation. And I just wanted to come back to that point, because I do think it's a very important point in Cooking Section's work, but also some of the examples that Heidi has put in the publication about that use of nature as a resource. And I think that just actually really thinking about that. And one of the things that's happened just before COP is we did a big event called Living Nature, which was bringing up the Indigenous experience of nature. And I know that you've just worked with an Indigenous speaker as well. We were just chatting about it in the week. And when you're talking to Indigenous people, it's not that they have nature and then they have them. They see themselves very much as part of nature. Their history is about nature. You know, the landscape is one with them. And I think there's a lot to be learnt for that, for the future, for us as human beings, that we can not have this use of it as a resource. So I was just wondering whether you've been kind of thinking about some of those things in terms of your work, and you know, really enabling people to have a broader view. As you said, I think, I can't remember, maybe it was Alon, the economy of Scotland is really dependent on salmon. How do we get people in communities in Scotland to take these things on and see them as things that are their issues and kind of interesting to them, and for them to shape that future, you know, so that they see the nature surrounding them in their islands, whether it's the fish, whether it's the birds, the sparrows, as part of their, important to them in their themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we touched upon before already. I think, first of all, with the transition kind of from models of ownership to usership, and how kind of there's like ways of kind of being with the environment rather than kind of seeing the environment as a resource. And I think that is, of course, it's a question that, yes, we can definitely look at kind of indigenous practices, and I think there's like a lot to learn from there. And I think the fact that there's, that's coming much more in kind of into like the discourse is important. And at the same time, I think these kind of things need to be like highly kind of site kind of responsive in a sense, and they have to come out of like histories of a place, which again, I mean, I think it's in the context of the highlands, right? Like talking about like indigenous culture, there's like, it has very kind of, it's an important conversation, but it's also a conversation that has like, it comes and opens up kind of many problems kind of to it, because first of all, kind of, not to give now a whole history of kind of the highlands, but very briefly, it's the fact that kind of in the kind of late 18th, 19th century, basically, as kind of slavery was being abolished, and kind of a lot of people that made money out of slavery had to kind of create a new commodity, right, that was kind of more local. Sheep became an extremely valuable species, basically, that cleared kind of with the capital that was kind of coming from the colonies and able to clear like the whole highlands from people in order to make room for grazing land, for sheep, for wool. And I think that you kind of, what you see from our perspective, what is happening today with the salmon industry, right? You're seeing a new wave of clearances that is just happening underwater, and it's kind of clearing and kind of suffocating the seabed. So in that sense, and yes, like how, when you're thinking about divesting away from these practices and developing kind of alternative kind of modes of kind of cultivation, in a sense, and cultivations of like habitats, of culture, of food, it's a super, super important question. And like that cannot, be done kind of through like replicating the models that exist. But then again, like how are you finding, and I think we spoke quite extensively about it in our presentation, like how do you look into kind of all of these like histories of using the coast, and the fact that for us the intertidal zone is like a really important space because it's a liminal zone. It's a space that is constantly shifting between like land and water. It's a space that kind of the ownership structures around it are like really murky. And there's this anthropologist called Bonnie McKay that we really love, that she talks about kind of the literality of the liminal zone, the fact that it's a space that is always shifting also enables a lot of room for action, because you can kind of find ways kind of within it to operate otherwise. So again, kind of if to tie it back, I think in our practice, it's really in the same way that kind of the art kind of, the space of cultural production and art can become a space of like opportunity for like other worlds. I think there's like within the environment, or kind of within legal structures, within economic structures, there are very kind of fruitful or fertile grounds kind of to work from and kind of to emerge alternative structures from.
And also something, perhaps a comment on indigeneity, which we ourselves included, sometimes we get really fascinated by how people like have these beautiful relationships with like non-human beings in other parts of the world, and we've been in conversation with many people from those backgrounds in different contexts. But also sometimes we don't need to go that far away, and also to look for like what would indigeneity mean today in our surroundings. Like, of course, completely radically different contexts, but still it also came up in a conversation with someone in Skype recently that for instance, in terms of in regards to the use of Gaelic language today, that sometimes perhaps we or people, we tend to romanticize it. It's incredible, and the moment that kind of part of culture disappears, also those relationships to the landscape disappear, from place names to, yeah, different ways of caring for ecology or kind of society at large. But also, it's been so contested to the point that people that were from Skye, that for a couple of generations, or if not more, were banned from learning Gaelic for being considered kind of barbarian, and you name it. So that has created a new tension that also who can afford themselves to learn Gaelic, which comes with a certain amount of time or resources to pay for Gaelic lessons, or just time to have to learn another language. Whereas people that were, let's say, indigenous to that, but have lost the language because of political structures and constructions, then they cannot afford themselves to actually learn that. And that brings an interesting tension for us, like, then how do you see indigeneity in that context with, it's also a class struggle at the end of the day.
That's a really fascinating, a really interesting analysis of that. I wondered if either of you wanted to ask a question of the other. I mean, we're obviously, TJ is in Santa Cruz and we're here, but I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to ask him about.
No, I guess it was interesting also, TJ, that we haven't met in person, but it was interesting how you opened your talk with a picture from the Otolith group. And I think we've spent a lot of hours in the same kitchen with Kojo and Anjali, talking about the same things. So yeah, we're curious to know also perhaps if you could talk a bit about, through their work, the work of the Otolith group, a collective based in London for many years. How also perhaps, because we've learned a lot from them, also to hear perhaps your lessons through your conversations.
Sure. And totally, I've had many really amazing conversations over the dinner table at the Otolith groups, or Anjali's and Kojo's place in London. I worked in London and lived there for 10 years, up until 2015, and learned a lot from the Otolith group, who are really good friends. And in terms of their practice, their films, their essay films, and the discursive elements of what they do, I think has been really, really important for me in terms of thinking, especially in terms of the speculative horizons that they're continually opening up in their practice. In some ways, it's a very abstruse, challenging representational system that they're dealing with in terms of the kind of montages that they put together, weaving history with speculative approaches to futurity, proposing ideas like past potential futures, thinking about histories of oppression, for instance, in terms of recently in terms of what they're calling the racial capitalist scene, the history of race and colonialism in relationship to climate injustice, has really just has been very important for me in terms of thinking critically about more conventional or mainstream ideas around the Anthropocene and art and ecology more broadly. So yeah, that's indeed a really important connection. I just wanted to come back to one thing that came up in the last conversation, and this is this move from property to use. And I think that I would agree that's a really crucial maneuver to try to bring about. And it reminds me of this book by Rob Nichols called "Theft is Property," which really locates this category of property itself in the widest sense of the term is so deeply embedded within European Enlightenment history and its aftermath that needs to be rethought. And I think indeed indigenous approaches to use and not just indigeneity is something that is vast and diverse depending on the context that we're talking about, whether it's the highlands or whether it's the Americas. But there are some really important overlaps in terms of challenging the rule of property. And this is maybe the most extreme and important, intense and ambitious horizon of speculative criticism that we can come up with these days. But within the Americas and indigenous practices around what they call land back, this is a crucial move toward not simply transferring property from settler colonialism to indigenous people who then will own the land. While they're demanding land back, it's also a complete radical reconfiguration of our relation to the land, of indigenous people's relation to the land, which is not premised on ownership, but actually on caretaking, which has come up so much, on a kind of responsibility and accountability to the land as a relationality, fundamentally a relationality, not something that can be objectified and commodified. So there's something I think really important within that formulation, and it connects as well to radical traditions within, for instance, long histories of socialism. So I think that this is really an exciting area of thinking in terms of how to connect these traditions and create solidarities between them. Not so much simply and potentially problematically to propose that we become indigenous. Although there's something interesting in that formulation, we need to, in other words, reinvent our relation to the land in ways that give priority to accountability, responsibility, ethical belonging, caretaking, and connection and support for the more than human realm. But I think there's, this is at least, I think, really crucial in terms of moving from property to use, from the objectification of land relations within the economic conditions of capital to entirely different ways of being and becoming with the land as a relationality.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, like also in this context that we're speaking today, and I think it started to come up earlier, it's like, because we're kind of sitting in a forum of like people that, companies that own kind of art collections, right? And I think it's like extending this, I think this shift that you're alluding for between kind of this idea of like property is theft and this kind of transition from kind of ownership to usership, right? Like, this has to kind of be extended kind of as an ecological practice to kind of all forms of life, right? And I think in that sense, for us, it's kind of this question of like practicing in an ecological time, and kind of that also has to kind of, how do we transform kind of the role of kind of cultural institutions, and in that sense also collections, like what does it mean to collect kind of for an ecological era, right? Like how do you kind of move from a space of kind of owning an object into a space that perhaps is kind of supporting processes and supporting kind of ecological processes that are transformative, and that are transformative internally and externally kind of at the same time. And I think this is like, yeah, it's a really kind of, for us, I think it would be really kind of fascinating to see like how that kind of could be like done, especially when you think about kind of the role of like collecting, right, as a way to kind of safeguard kind of culture for the future generation. But it's like, what is kind of culture for the future generation if the environment and ecology cannot be supporting kind of that?
Brilliant. I think if there's not any more questions, just anyone else who wants to ask a question? Okay, I think I'm going to move on to the kind of closing remarks and thanks, if that's all right with everybody here. Yep. So obviously, thank you very much to our panel. I think we'll start with a clap for them.